Hello again, friends, and welcome back to the Soul Unleashed podcast. I'm your host, Mike Nicholas, and I'm basically a left-brainer struggling with spiritual questions, and I share that exploration and adventure with you. Thank you. Here we go. Hello, friends and fellow truth seekers. Mike Nicholas here again. Welcome back to the Soul Unleashed. I want to talk today about one of my favorite subjects, which is what happens when we die, and more specifically, what if learning doesn't stop when we die? So today is Good Friday, and I'm not sure when you'll be listening to this, but Good Friday has always been a special day for me. If you've been listening to my podcast or read my book, you know I grew up Catholic. And so as a young child growing up, and my mother would always tell us we couldn't go out and play on Good Friday, even though we had off from school, because Jesus was hanging from the cross from noon till 3. Now, I'm not sure where that time frame came from, but that was the deal. We couldn't go out and play during that time. I was the oldest of 5 children. God bless her. She was trying to do what she could to keep us in the house. And I remember we said the rosary, usually on Good Friday. But it's usually during this time of the year, during Holy Week, that I tend to think a little bit more about spiritual topics. So what I want to do is start this podcast with something my mother told me recently. Now, obviously, it wasn't in person. My mother has been gone for some years now. She passed away in 2016. But more recently, through a medium I've come to trust, my mother came through with a message. And part of what she said was this: the lessons we didn't finish here, the ones we left incomplete, the growth we put off, the healing we never quite got to, we carry those with us into spirit. And we have to learn from there. We have to learn those lessons again there in spirit. And because if that's true, I'll tell you why I'm increasingly convinced it is, that almost everything most of us were taught about what happens after we die needs a second look. If you grew up in a traditional Christian household, or especially a Catholic one like mine, you were given a pretty specific view of the afterlife. You die, you face judgment, and depending upon how you lived, you go to one of 3 places: heaven, hell, or in the Catholic tradition, purgatory, which is kind of a waiting room, a purification that you go through before you get to heaven. Purgatory is always described to me as, a place of burning and punishment, kind of like a budget version of hell, but you eventually get to heaven. I've done a couple podcasts about purgatory. That's another one of my favorite topics. But anyway, heaven was painted as an eternal rest place, eternal joy, the beatific vision, standing in the full light of God, beyond all want, beyond all pain. You worshiped there, you were at peace. Maybe there were harps, maybe there were angels. The images kind of shift, but the underlying message was always the same. You arrive, you stop, and you're done. The work is over. Now, I'm not here to mock that picture. I was formed by it. There's something genuinely beautiful in the idea of a soul finally at rest, finally home. St. Augustine captured it better than almost anyone when he wrote that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. But here's what started nagging at me. And I think if you're honest with yourself, maybe it's nagged you too. What kind of rest involves no growth? What kind of love involves no learning? And if we spend 80 years here on earth, stumbling, struggling, sometimes getting it right, often getting it badly wrong, and then we die having only partially figured it out, is eternal static peace really the next chapter? Or is it something else entirely? And here's something that might surprise you. When you go past the Sunday school version and look at what the great doctors of the church actually wrote, there's more nuance and more movement than you might expect. St. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, was precise about purgatory. What I'm about to read to you is from the supplement to the Summa Theologica, Appendix 2, Article 1, and I want to read this carefully because I think it matters. This is what St. Thomas said: "It is sufficiently clear that there is a purgatory after this life. For if the debt of punishment is not paid in full, after the stain of sin has been washed away by contrition, nor again are venial sins always removed when mortal sins are remitted, and if justice demands that sin be set in order by due punishment, it follows that one who after contrition for his fault and after being absolved dies before making due satisfaction is punished after this life. So St. Augustine framed this as justice, not cruelty, that it was a matter of justice that we would be punished, and that the soul is completing something that was genuinely unfinished. But that phrase that he uses, dies before making due satisfaction, is doing a lot of work. Aquinas is describing purgatory not as punishment for its own sake, but as completing what was left unfinished. Something began here and continues there. He goes even further. He describes what he calls a twofold pain in purgatory. And when you hear both of these, you understand why I think one is certainly more painful than the other. But he describes it like this. In purgatory will be a twofold pain. One will be the pain of loss, namely the delay of the beatific vision, and the pain of sense, namely punishment by corporal fire. With regard to both, the least pain of purgatory surpasses the greatest pain of this life. For the more a thing is desired, the more painful is the absence. So here he's describing that the pain of loss is a longing soul, not a passive one. So this is a soul that wants to arrive, it wants to complete the journey. It's not a soul that's done learning. And it's this longing, the soul longing, that is the more painful of the pain, and not the whole fire punishment thing. So think about that. It isn't the fire, it's the ache of not yet being in the presence of God, because the soul's desire is completely undiluted, unmuffled by the noise of the body. The soul knows exactly what it's missing and it longs for it. This is not a picture of a static soul. This is a picture of a soul still moving towards something. And then there's the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is written much more recently, and which affirms all of this officially. I'm going to quote just a brief sentence or two from paragraph 1030 through 1032. It says, "All who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. But after death, they undergo purification, so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. The Church gives the name purgatory to this final purification of the elect, which is entirely different from the punishment of the damned." So the word achieve is kind of an active word. Something is being accomplished. The soul arrives at holiness. It doesn't merely receive it. And I think that's worth thinking about. For my Protestant friends and many sola scriptura friends, I know that this in itself is kind of heresy. That you're redeemed by the blood of Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, and there's no need for purification or purgatory after death. But I'm just relaying what my experience has been, especially as a Catholic, with learning about purgatory. So I want to be honest here. The Church frames all of this as purification, burning away what isn't God. It doesn't use the word school. It doesn't use the language of learning that maybe modern afterlife literature uses. But the underlying logic, I think, is the same. Something incomplete is being completed. Something unfinished is being finished, even if you call it purgatory. And that's exactly what the people on the other side keep telling us when we ask and when they answer. Now let me bring this back to the more personal, because that's where it becomes real for me. A few years ago, I had a session with Rebecca Rosen. She's a well-known medium. She made contact with someone I'll call Matt, my son. She provided enough validation that I was convinced that she was actually communicating with him. And at that time, Rebecca told me that Matt was undergoing a life review. This wasn't long after he passed, and so it was one of the first few times that I had made contact with him. And Rebecca said that he was going through this life review kind of like a school. He was going back over his life, looking at it from multiple perspectives, seeing not just what he did, but how it affected others, and he was learning from it. And fast forward now, almost 5 years later, through another medium, I received communication from Matt again. And this time the message was still different, but still consistent. He said he was still in school, but it wasn't a life review. He was learning lessons that he needed to know. He was studying and continuing to learn. And my mother's message, that incompleteness follow us, and we have access to learning once we die, we have to address it in spirit. Her message landed on top of all of that. So the message of continuing to grow and to continuing to learn after we die is what keeps coming through. I just want to add here that for whatever reason, both my parents and my son keep coming through recently. And it's been an amazing set of validations and confirmations that they provided. Not only that it's them, but that they see what's going on in my life every day. I went out and visited Matt's grave at the cemetery a week or so ago on the anniversary of his death. And Matt came through and said that he saw us there and described something there that that no one would know unless you were there. And the same thing about something I was doing just in the house, around the house, looking at something that was his, and he described that and said that he had seen me doing that. The point was that they want us to know that they're still with us, they're still available to us and able to see us and participate in our lives. I need probably to be careful here though. I'm an engineer by training, a project manager by profession, and I don't say these things lightly. I spent years trying to apply something like the genealogical proof standard to spiritual evidence. I'm also into genealogy, but the GPS or genealogical proof standard is how you make sure that you don't make links to other family members or ancestors without sufficient proof. So I'm always looking for corroboration, consistency, specificity that can't be easily explained away. And what I keep finding is this pattern that the dead are not idle. They're not sitting in eternal bliss doing nothing. They're working, they're learning, they're observing, they're progressing. Of course, I'm not alone in finding this pattern. There's actually a substantial body of literature from researchers, from mediums, from near-death experiencers that points in exactly the same direction. There's a gentleman named Michael Newton who was a hypnotherapist who spent decades taking patients into what he called life between lives under deep regression. And he published his findings in a book called Journey of Souls, another one called Destiny of Souls. And what he found across thousands of sessions with clients who had no connection to each other was remarkably consistent. Dr. Newton's books were some of the first ones I read once I was starting this journey. And there's plenty of detractors. There's people who think it's impossible or ludicrous to things to be the way that he described. But he was simply passing on what he found and talking to thousands of people. Souls return to a kind of a spiritual home. They review their lives. They meet with guides and elders. They join what Newton called soul groups, communities of souls at similar levels of development. And they study, they prepare, they set intentions for what they still need to learn. It fascinated me and continues to fascinate me. Another author is Helen Greaves. She wrote a book called Testimony of Light, and it was recorded communications she believed she received from her friend, Frances Banks, who was a nun who had passed away. Frances described the spirit world in careful, almost clinical detail. There's rest first, then a process of reviewing and releasing, then active work in what she described as schools and halls of learning. She specifically said that souls continued their spiritual education, working on the qualities they hadn't fully developed in their earthly lives. Another author, Geraldine Cummins, her book is The Road to Immortality. She received, she believed, communications from a gentleman named Frederick Myers. He was a great psychical researcher. Myers described multiple levels of existence, each one requiring the soul to develop something new, to let go of something old, and then to become something more. And there's also a book called The Afterlife of Billy Fingers by Annie Kagan. Her brother Billy, who died suddenly and unexpectedly, communicated with her in the weeks and months after his death. He describes a progression, stages, lessons, a deepening, not a fixed place, but a continuing journey. And of course, there are many other books. They're almost countless, but another doctor whom I read was Brian Weiss. There was a gentleman named Raymond Moody There are so many, and when I started getting into this and reading this, I kept thinking, where has this been all my life? How did I not know about this stuff? But I have to say the pattern is consistent when you're reading, whether it be from a Catholic mystic from the 13th century, a British spiritualist from the 1960s, or a New York woman processing her grief in the 2010s. Something is happening on the other side. Something that looks an awful lot like school. So, what's the point, Mike? Well, here's the question I can't shake. If we're still learning in spirit, if there are lessons we didn't finish here on earth, qualities we didn't develop, healing we didn't do, then what is the point of all that learning? Learning implies a goal. Growth implies a direction. If I'm studying mathematics, for example, I'm studying because I'm going to use it. If I'm studying AI, I'm studying it because I want to use it. If I'm in school because there's something I need to know. So what are souls in spirit studying for? Now, the traditional Catholic answer might be to finally be ready for the full presence of God. Purgatory completes what was left unfinished, and then the journey ends in the beatific vision, where you are at the throne of God. That's a coherent explanation, and I don't dismiss that. And if you're fine with that, and millions and millions are, that's wonderful. But here's what the evidence from mediums, from near-death experiencers, from past life regression work keeps suggesting. The learning doesn't stop at some final destination. The learning leads somewhere next. And that somewhere, in many of the accounts, involves coming back here. And it's not because you're forced to, not as punishment, but because there are things you can only learn in a body. There are experiences that only the incarnate existence can give you. Things like love, loss, time, choice, consequence. And if the soul is genuinely on a journey of growth, then it makes sense. It makes engineering sense, if you want to put it that way, that the classroom you keep coming back to is this one, this life, this world. I've read many times that the earth is a tough school in terms of spiritual learning, and that souls come here deliberately to learn tough lessons. Now, reincarnation is the word most people reach for, and I know that word makes a lot of traditionally religious people uncomfortable. It's not Catholic doctrine, it's not mainline Protestant, but here's what I've noticed. It keeps showing up in the data. It keeps showing up in the experiences, and it is remarkably consistent with what the great mystical traditions, including some within Christianity itself, including some of the early church fathers, actually believed. And speaking of fathers of the church, now is probably a good time to mention somebody called Origen of Alexandria. He lived during the 1st century AD. He's one of the most brilliant and controversial figures in the early church. And he taught a concept called apokatastasis, which means the restoration of all things. And his core idea was that souls exist before birth, and they fall from the state of being close to God, and through a long process of learning, purification, and growth across a multiple version of different worlds, every soul eventually returns to God. It's actually fascinating that he had this opinion, thousands of years ago. He didn't use the word reincarnation exactly, but his framework implied something very close to it. Souls progressing through successive states of existence, learning what they failed to learn until the work was complete. Now, you haven't heard much, and you won't hear much about Origen anymore because he kind of got kicked out of the club of early church fathers. The Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD condemned his specific formulations, particularly the concept of the restoration of all things. And he was officially declared a heretic posthumously and found his ideas were not consistent with what the church believed. So anyway, I wanted to mention that because Origen sometimes is quoted as a church father who believed in reincarnation. He never used that word, but he did talk about souls progressing and souls growing and going through processes of learning. So in closing here, I'm not here to tell you what to believe, obviously. Not that anybody would pay attention to me anyway. This show isn't about telling you what to believe. I'm just sharing with you questions that I have And what I'm here to tell you is that the evidence I've encountered personally through mediumship, through research, through the writings of people far wiser than me, consistently points to a soul that is not finished when the body stops. It's a soul that is active, learning, growing, preparing, and a soul that is in some very meaningful sense still very much in school and existing in a parallel universe, if you will, right alongside of us. And if that's true, then death looks a lot less like an ending and more like a transfer. So if you've had experiences with these kind of things, or anything that I've said resonates with you, you've had communications perhaps from people you lost, moments that made you wonder, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at mikenicholas.com, which is my website. It's where I've got my book and some other videos about orbs. But you can also reach me through my email, mike@mikenicholas.com. Thank you. Look forward to talking to you again soon.